After studying this module, you shall be able to know about the concepts of public debt and fiscal imbalance, understand the classification of public debt, assess the burden of internal and external debt, understand the measures needed to reduce public debt, analyze the causes and consequences of fiscal imbalance, and assess the measures adopted to correct fiscal imbalance.
Indian economy is considered as the fastest growing economy. However, there are certain drawbacks such as fiscal deficits and debts which hinder India from achieving its goal. These have remained high regardless of rapid economic growth in recent years and irregular attempts to inspire greater fiscal discipline. To ensure fiscal discipline by the centre and state, the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act was passed in Parliament in 2003. The main objectives of various legislations over the years are to eliminate revenue deficits and reduce fiscal deficit to or below 3% of GDP. In a country, fiscal deficit occurs when government spending exceeds tax receipts. Fiscal debt is the amount of funds the government must borrow to cover its deficit. Size of public debt is measured by the debt ratio that can be calculated by finding out the government debt as a percentage of GDP. Deficit and debt must be expressed in real terms or adjusted for inflation, as calculating deficit in nominal value results in an overstatement of the amount of debt required to cover the deficit. Deficit and debt move pro-cyclically. They fall during slump and rise during a boom. To solve this problem, the government calculates a cyclically adjusted budget deficit, which is the amount of deficit at full employment. Any growth which is inflationary financed results in increased tax revenue and government spending to cause deficit and inflation. Moreover, a substantial reduction in long-term perspective deficit will significantly lower long-term inflation expectations. Deficit finance growth increases debt with no real income growth but higher inflation. Due to the tight monetary policy stance adopted by the Reserve Bank of India for a sustained period of time to control inflation, the burden of correcting macroeconomic imbalances and reviving growth seems to have fallen entirely on the union budget and fiscal policy. Public debt or public borrowing is considered to be an important source of income to the government. If revenue collected through taxes and other sources is not adequate to cover the government expenditure, government may resort to borrowing. Such borrowings become necessary more in times of financial crisis and emergencies like war, droughts, etc. Public debt may be raised internally or externally. Internal debt refers to public debt floated within the country, while external debt refers to loans floated outside the country.
Public debt may be classified as productive and unproductive debt, voluntary and compulsory debt, short-term, medium-term and long-term debt, redeemable and irredeemable debt, funded and unfunded debt, internal and external debt. Productive debt. Public debt is said to be productive when it is raised for productive purposes such as railways, irrigation projects, power generation, and is used to add to the productive capacity of the economy. The interest and principal amount is generally paid out of income earned by the government from these projects. As productive loans are self-liquidating, they should be repaid within the lifetime of the property. Such loans do not cause any net burden on the community. Unproductive debt. Unproductive debts are those which are raised to meet expenses on war, famine relief, social services, and these do not add to the productive capacity of the economy. As unproductive debts are not necessarily self liquidating, the interest and principal amount may have to be paid from other sources of revenue, generally from taxation, and so such debts are a burden on the community. Voluntary debt. These loans are provided by the members of the public on a voluntary basis. Most of the loans obtained by the government are voluntary in nature. The voluntary debt may be obtained in the form of market loans, bonds, etc. The government makes an announcement in the media to obtain such loans. Compulsory debt. A compulsory debt, like the compulsory deposit scheme, where the public is asked to contribute as a compulsion during some special circumstances like war or crisis. The rate of interest on such loans may be low. Short-term debt. Short-term debt, like treasury bills of 91 days and 182 days, matures within a duration of 3 to 9 months and are incurred to cover temporary shortages of funds. Interest rates are generally low on such loans. Medium-term debt. The government may borrow funds for medium-term needs. These funds can be used for development and non-development activities. The period of medium-term debt is normally for a period above 1 year and up to 5 years. One of the main forms of medium-term debt is by way of market loans. Long-term debt. Long-term debt has a maturity period of 10 years or more. Generally, the rate of interest is high. Such loans are raised for developmental programs and to meet other long-term needs of public authorities. Redeemable debt. The debt which the government promises to pay off at some future date is called redeemable debt. Most of the debt is redeemable in nature. There is a certain maturity period of the debt. Irredeemable debt. Such a debt has no maturity period. In this case, the government may pay the interest regularly, but the repayment date of the principal amount is not fixed. Irredeemable debt is also called perpetual debt. Normally, the government does not resort to such borrowing. Funded debt. Funded debt is repayable after a long period of time, such as 30 years or more. Funded debt has an obligation to pay fixed sum of interest subject to an option to the government to repay the principal. The government may repay it even before the maturity if market conditions are favorable. Unfunded debt. Unfunded debts are incurred to meet the temporary needs of the government. In such debts, duration is comparatively short, for instance, a year. The rate of interest on unfunded debt is very low. Unfunded debt has an obligation to pay at the due date with interest. The government borrows funds from internal and external sources. Internal debt. Internal debt refers to the funds borrowed by the government from various internal sources within the country, like individuals, banks, business firms, and others. The various instruments of internal debt include market loans, bonds, treasury bills, etc. Internal debt is repayable only in domestic currency. It implies a redistribution of income and wealth within the country, and so it has no direct money burden. External debt. External loans are raised from foreign countries or international institutions and are repayable in foreign currencies. External loans help to take up various developmental programs in developing and underdeveloped countries. These loans are usually voluntary.
Public debt in India. During recent years, public debt in India has been growing at an alarming rate. The underdeveloped nature of the economy and institutional credit deficiencies make the financing of economic development a complicated problem. Hence, the government has to play a key role in stimulating the rate of capital formation and in promoting the economic development of the economy. The instrument of public debt take the form of government bonds or securities of various kinds. Such securities are drawn as a contract between government and lenders. By issuing securities, the government raises a public loan and incurs a liability to repay both the principal and interest amount as per contract. In India, government issues treasury bills, post office savings certificates, national savings certificates as instruments of public borrowings.
Let us now discuss the components of internal debt. The first of these is market loan. This has a maturity period of 12 months or more at the time of issue and is generally interest bearing. The government issues such loans almost every year. These loans are raised in the open market by sale of securities or otherwise. Bonds. The government borrows funds by way of issue of bonds. The government obtains funds through the issue of bonds such as national rural development bonds, central investment bonds. The bonds are issued at different maturity periods, which may range from 3 years to 10 years. They provide medium term to long term funds to the government. Treasury bills. A major source of short term funds for the government is obtained by the issue of treasury bills. At present, the government issues 91-day and 364-day treasury bills. The treasury bills are purchased by commercial banks and others. Special floating and other loans. These represent India's contribution towards share capital of international financial institutions like IMF, World Bank, International Development Agency. These are non-negotiable and non-interest bearing securities. The Government of India is liable to pay the amount at the call of these institutions. Accordingly, it is a short-term debt upon the Government of India. Special securities issued by RBI. The government obtains temporary loans for a period of maximum 12 months from RBI and issues special securities which are non-negotiable and non-interest bearing. Such securities provide short-term funds to the government. Ways and means advances. The Government of India obtains ways and means advances from the Reserve Bank of India to meet its short period expenditure. These debts are purely temporary in nature and are usually repaid within 3 months. Securities against small savings. Since 1999-2000, under the new accounting system, national small savings have been converted into the central government securities. As a result, there has been a sharp increase in internal debt and corresponding decline in small savings. External debt. External debt refers to the liabilities of the Indian government, public sector, private sector, and financial institutions to overseas parties. External debt can be broadly divided into two groups: long term debt and short term debt. Long term debt includes multilateral borrowings, bilateral borrowings, loans from IMF, World Bank, etc. Short term debt. The overall external debt of India comprises of government debt and non-government debt. The government debt is owed by government authorities, both central and state governments, whereas the non-government debt is owed by private parties in India. In terms of composition, India's external debt has shifted in favor of private debt over the last decade. Apart from internal and external debt, there are other internal liabilities constituting the public debt in India. The government does not include liabilities under public debt. However, the government is liable to make repayment of these liabilities. Small savings. In recent years, small savings have increased due to rising money income in the economy. Provident funds. Provident funds are divided into two categories: Employee Provident Fund, meant for employees, and public provident funds meant for the general public. Other accounts. Other accounts include postal insurance and life annuity fund, borrowings against compulsory deposits, income tax annuity deposit, special deposit of non-government provident fund, and outstanding amount. Reserve funds and deposits. Reserve funds and deposits are divided into two categories: interest bearings and non interest bearing, which include depreciation and reserve funds of railways, Department of Post, telecommunication, deposits of local funds, departmental and judicial deposits, etc. Burden of public debt. Both internal and external debt carry a major burden on the economy. Let us now briefly discuss the burden of internal public debt. Internal debt trap. Interest payments on debt increase public expenditure and may become a cause for fiscal deficit. If internal public debt is not checked and kept within limits, it may take the country to the position of internal debt trap. More burden on the poor and weaker sections. Internal debt provides opportunities for the rich and higher middle class to earn a higher rate of interest from the state on their lending. At the same time, the poor suffer due to the additional tax burden as the government levies taxes to repay interest on public debt. Increasing interest burden. Public borrowing may become costlier for the government, especially when it resorts to public borrowing by issuing bonds and debentures. Such bonds and debentures carry a high rate of interest. Unjustified transfer. The government imposes taxes on enterprises and earnings from productive efforts for the benefit of the idle, inactive, old, and leisurely class of bondholders. Hence, work and productive risk taking efforts are penalized for the benefit of accumulated wealth. This adds to the net real burden of debts. Indirect real burden. Internal debt involves an additional indirect real burden in an economy, as taxation required for servicing the debts reduces the taxpayer's ability to work and save, thereby affecting production adversely.
The burden of external public debt. External debt is beneficial in the initial stages as it increases the resources available to the country, but its repayment and servicing creates a burden on the debtor country. First, external debt trap. The external debt creates a direct money burden as it involves transfer of funds from the debtor country to foreign citizens. The degree of burden depends both on the loan amount and interest rate. The loans are normally to be paid in foreign currency. Therefore, the funds are mostly transferred from export earnings or by raising more funds from foreign markets. Borrowing by way of additional loans puts an extra burden on the country. The situation may worsen over time and the debtor country may be caught in the external debt trap. Secondly, direct real burden. The external debt may also result in direct real burden. The citizens of the debtor country will have to suffer loss of economic welfare to the extent of repayment of principal amount and interest burden. The foreign currency earned through exports would have been utilized to import better goods and technology, which would have increased the economic welfare of the citizens of the debtor country. But because of external debt repayment, the citizens of the debtor country are deprived of imported goods and services till the loans and interest amount is repaid. Thirdly, decline in expenditure to public welfare programs. When the government spends significant portion of its resources towards the payment of foreign debt, it reduces the government expenditure to that extent which otherwise would have been spent for public welfare programs. Fourthly, decline in the value of nation's currency. The repayment of external debt involves an increase in the demand for the currency of the creditor country. This will raise the exchange rate of the creditor country's currency and aggravate the problem of foreign exchange. Fifthly, burden of unproductive foreign debt. The magnitude of external debt burden depends upon whether the debt is incurred for productive purposes or for unproductive purposes. If it is incurred for unproductive purposes, it will create a greater burden and sacrifice on the citizens of the debtor country. Sixthly, political exploitation. In recent years, it was found that the lending countries who dominate international organizations like World Bank and IMF use the lending opportunity as an instrument to exploit the borrowing countries economically and politically.
Public debt management in India. The increase in public debt puts a burden on the citizens of the country and adversely affects the growth and development of the economy. Effective management of public debt requires controlling the amount of borrowings, productive use of borrowed funds for development, and the repayment of public debt. Reduction in primary deficit. Corrective action with respect to the growing internal debt must be carried out in two stages. In the first stage, action must be directed towards slowing down the pace of growth of the debt ratio or reducing it to a reasonable level. In the second stage, attempts must be made to contain most revenue expenditures within the revenues raised by the government so that the government's net borrowing is used only for productive purposes. Reduction of current expenditure. In order to reduce primary deficit, more emphasis has to be placed on reducing the growth of current expenditure of the government than on raising the rate of growth of revenues. Raising efficiency of borrowing program of central government. The RBI has played a major role in improving the efficiency of borrowing programs of the central government, making it more market oriented. Reforms in debt management of states. The sale of state government loans continues to be outdated. There is no scope for better managed states to access funds at competitive rates of interest. So, it is necessary to bring flexibility in the borrowing programs of the state governments with the help of RBI initiatives. Foreign institutional investors and public debt. Foreign institutional investors have been permitted to invest in government debt by investing only in dated government securities. Consolidated Sinking Fund (CSF). The CSF has the objective of breaking the vicious cycle of rise in repayment burden of public debt. Even the state governments should set up such a fund in view of the problem of the repayment of loans. Improving the state of debt market. Since 1997, the RBI has taken various measures to widen and deepen the debt market in India. These measures include uniform price auction of 91 days treasury bills, undertaking repos in non-government debt instruments, sale of capital index bonds, etc. Appropriate disinvestment policy. The government should disinvest in public sector units which are not strategic or are sick. Disinvestment enables the government to raise funds which can then be utilized to repay a part of the public debt. Let us now understand fiscal imbalance. Fiscal imbalance is a mismatch in the revenue powers and expenditure responsibilities of a government. Two types of fiscal imbalances are vertical fiscal imbalance and horizontal fiscal imbalance. A vertical fiscal imbalance describes a situation where revenues do not match expenditures for different levels of government. When the fiscal imbalance is measured between the two levels of government, center and states, it is called vertical fiscal imbalance. A horizontal imbalance describes a situation where revenues do not match expenditures for different regions of the country. When the fiscal imbalance is measured between the governments at the same level, It is called horizontal fiscal imbalance. This imbalance is also known as regional disparity. Indicators of fiscal imbalance. Fiscal imbalance can be measured by deficits such as revenue deficit, which is measured as the difference between revenue receipts income and revenue expenditure; budgetary deficit, which is measured as the difference between total expenditure and total receipts. Here, both revenue and capital expenditure and receipts are considered; fiscal deficit, which is measured as the excess of total expenditure over revenue receipts and grants; primary deficit, which is measured as the fiscal deficit minus interest payments. Causes of fiscal imbalance. The main factors responsible for fiscal imbalance in India are increase in subsidies, excessive government borrowings and interest burden, defense expenditure, poor performance of public sector, weak revenue mobilization, and tax evasion. Let us now discuss how fiscal imbalance can be controlled. Fiscal imbalance can be corrected by 1. Reducing government expenditure. 2. Raising government funds. Let us discuss these measures individually. Reducing government expenditure. Reducing interest burden. Over the years, there has been considerable increase in government borrowings. As a result, the interest payment of the government has increased considerably. Therefore, there is a need to reduce government borrowings so as to reduce the interest burden, which in turn would reduce government expenditure. Reducing subsidies. The government of India has been providing massive amounts of subsidies on a number of items such as food, fertilizers, education, petroleum. There is need to reduce government subsidies in order to keep a check on its expenditure. Reducing government overheads. The public sector and government departments are subject to high overheads due to overstaffing, mismanagement, inefficiencies, and corruption. There is a need to reduce overheads wherever possible to reduce government expenditure. Closure of sick units. The government needs to close down the sick public sectors or disinvest in them. Closing down non-viable sick units would enable the government to save valuable resources, and disinvestments would generate additional revenue to the government. Raising government funds. Collection of user charges. The government should take adequate measures to collect user charges from the consumer in respect of public utilities like water supply, electricity, irrigation, transport, etc. Improvement in the performance of PSUs. Due to poor performance of PSUs, the government loses a good amount of revenue by way of dividends. Therefore, the government should make every effort to improve efficiency and performance of public sector units PSUs, which in turn would enable the government to obtain more funds for productive expenditure. Proper mobilization of tax resources. The government should make efforts to simplify the tax procedures, introduce e-tax filing, and take stringent measures to reduce tax evasion. Market-oriented development. Market-oriented development will stimulate demand and encourage growth.
Let us now summarize what we have learned in this module. India can achieve better fiscal consolidation by strengthening methods of expenditure control. 2. Emphasizing on appropriate resource allocation. Third, adopting a stable tax policy environment. Fourth, simplifying tax structure and laws. Fifth, introducing reasonable direct taxes and better tax administration. Sixth, understanding equity consequences of taxation. 7. Effective fiscal marksmanship and public debt management. 8th, placing more reliance on fiscal and financial instruments. 9th, establishing better links between fiscal and monetary policy.